Well, first, let me thank you for inviting me back again. I was here in October, and it's nice to be back in a place that's now a little bit familiar to me. Before the reading, let me ask you a question. How many of you have heard anything at all or are familiar with the phrase process theology? A few. Okay. Well, it's a movement in theological thinking that goes back to the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who was writing about a century ago in the 1920s and 30s. And this reading is from the writings of Marjorie Suchocki, who was one of the leading process theologians of the 20th century. She's still alive and very much sharp of mind at the age of 90. But this particular essay, the particular excerpt I'm going to read, is from an old essay of hers written back in 1983. And in it, she is asking us to think of theology as a garment that is woven out of ideas and ways of thinking from both feminist theology and process theology. Here's what she wrote back in 1983. From strands of feminist and process modes of thought, what kind of garment can be woven? Let me play with the metaphor by noting that garments come in sizes: big, small, good fit, loose fit. Garments are not abstract. They are to be tried on, worn out, mended, patched. The weavings of thought are like a garment, woven from experience. The garment will fit some and not fit others. It can survive many wearings and be adapted to new times, or it can wear out beyond patching in a relatively short time. Both process thought and feminist thought call attention to the garment-like nature of our worldviews. Before I began the study of theology, she says, I had the entire world figured out. I knew the divine mind and the divine plan and the whole scheme of things. My theology then was not like a garment, but like a thing of crystal, which encased me, rigid and ungiving. One dark night, I woke from a terrible dream, which was more than a dream, continued into my waking. The crystal theology surrounding me, protecting me from the world, had cracked completely and crumbled, falling in tinkling shards to my feet. Now there was only darkness, and I was falling through it. Only there was no place to fall, no walls, no bottom, no ceiling, no God. God had crumbled with the crystal, and I no longer knew the divine mind or the divine plan. This was all a long time ago, certainly before I had become a feminist or knew of process theology, but I still remember the agony of that night. And now, skipping ahead to a later period in her life, she continues, a feminist/process theology calls for a new strand to be woven into our theologies, the strand of humility. It calls for theology to lose its abstractness and to view itself as the garment woven of our experience, to play with theological ideas, to experiment, to listen to differences with interest rather than with a sense of threat. What to do with a theology which is only a garment? Why, wear it, of course, and in the wearing, to test it. It will require all the washings and mendings, which is appropriate to garments. And when our garment has been woven not only with our own stuff, but with strands given to us by the experiences of others, then our garment might begin to reflect the richness of this world's community. In my own perspectival relative way, I rather think that God intended us thus to weave our theologies all along. Here ends the reading, and let's listen to some music as this sinks in. What kind of a world, what kind of a universe do we live in? Why do things happen as they do? Who or what is in charge? Is the universe friendly? Is it cruel? Is it all an accident? Do things happen randomly as a result of universal laws that determine every last thing and leave no room for freedom? Or by some inscrutable divine plan that we can never understand? At some era in human history, our ancestors began to ask questions like these. And you know something about the answers that those early people thousands of years ago came up with. Gods and goddesses, typically, basically projections of human people and society and characteristics, projections up onto a kind of big TV screen in the sky. Then, starting in Israel about 3,000 years ago, the idea of a single God arose, a creator God, a God who demands not burnt offerings and empty rituals, but justice as the greatest human responsibility. And you all know how this idea of God was carried forward from Judaism first into Christianity and then later into Islam. At their best, all three of these monotheistic religions have tried, and I emphasize tried, to maintain the idea of a world of beauty and goodness, with us as human beings of worth and dignity and intelligence, created in the image of a loving God. But ideas change. We change. Our knowledge of the world changes. And old theologies stop making sense. Magical thinking doesn't work for us anymore, most of us. Scientific models increasingly explain and allow us to manipulate more and more of the physical world, the world of atoms, of chemistry, biology, cell biology, and the evolution of plants and animals, electronic technology, human physiology, medical and surgical interventions. Increasingly, we know about such things. But beyond all of those, beyond that realm of experience, lie questions of meaning, questions of good and evil, right and wrong, values of beauty and truth, human freedom and moral responsibility. Theology purports to deal with such things. And we are all theologians, whether you have thought of yourself as that in that way or not. At some level, each one of us has some kind of worldview, some set of beliefs or pictures or practices or words or gut feelings, maybe, that gives us an understanding of the human meaning of this world that we live in and what our place in it is, what our responsibilities are in the world and to each other, and what our ultimate fate is, either individually or collectively. Now, you may not spend a lot of your waking hours thinking about questions like these, but you probably did ask them at some point or multiple points in your life. If your religious story is anything like mine, then it was some kind of questioning that first brought you perhaps away from a childhood religious understanding and to this or some other UU congregation where you were looking for a new perspective, something broader and more open. Basic beliefs that we had as children or younger adults eventually come to seem naive and like garments that we've outgrown. We need to shuck off those youthful theologies and clothe ourselves with more sophisticated ways of understanding the world. We do this as individuals with differing experiences, histories, and perspectives. And our entire UU tradition has made theological shifts over the years as individual people's thinking began to push the boundaries of what the church believed. For example, take the Orthodox Christian doctrine of original sin. Back in the Reformation of the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, one of the first places where non-Trinitarian ideas began to spring up and form churches was in Poland. Our cousins, our religious liberal cousins there, the Polish brethren, were led by an Italian theologian named Fausto Sozzini. And he challenged the idea of original sin. He challenged the idea of divine omniscience, the idea that God knows in advance what the future is. That, said Sozzini, makes no sense because we as human beings have freedom and all other creatures have freedom to make choices, and those choices will determine what the future is going to be. And nobody knows, not even God can know what that future is because we haven't made the choices yet that will define that future. So way back in the 1580s, ideas like this were challenging traditional theologies, repairing the bad parts of pre-existing theologies. Something similar happened 2 centuries later in New England, when more liberal-minded people in congregational churches began to think of human nature as basically good and improvable and educable, rather than sinful and most likely condemned to hell, as the standard Puritan theology of those days was preaching. In both of those eras, of the 1560s in Poland and the 1760s in Massachusetts, the old theological garments ceased to fit. They became constricting, intellectually unacceptable, and needed some alterations. Maybe taking out a seam here and there, or taking it in, or expanding it, or maybe tossing it out and buying a new garment. The liberal wing of the Boston clergy loosened their old theological garments and made room for a more positive view of human nature as worthy of dignity and honor, even salvation. A few decades later, they would be kicked out by the Orthodox Christians and proclaim themselves Unitarians. But the task wasn't finished. Changes go on. Those early Unitarians still held on to the concept of a God that was both supernatural and all-powerful. You know what the problem is. If God is really loving and all-powerful, then why can God allow evil and suffering to exist? And so we come to the challenge of evil. Academic theologians call this the problem of theodicy. How do we reconcile an omnipotent and benevolent God with allowing evil to go on? In earlier times, and still today in many segments of our society, when some illness or natural disaster occurs, many people will come up with what I would call one-sentence theologies of things. I'm sure you've all heard these, like everything happens for a reason, or it's all part of God's plan, or it's God's punishment for this or that human sin or evil doing. We hear a lot of this in today's society. Some people are so determined to hang on to the traditional idea of God that they invent simplistic workarounds like these to reassure themselves. But the real problem, at least in my view, is that our ideas about God have become outdated, just badly mistaken and badly in need of repair. Now, in our UU congregations, people react to this challenge in a variety of ways. Some will just chuck out the word God altogether as something empty of meaning, at least any helpful meaning. The universe is just impersonal, uncaring, and devoid of moving in any direction of goodness or beauty or truth. Another approach common among Unitarian Universalists is that we like the comforting idea of some spiritual force, some higher power that may be influencing the world in some way, but don't want to call it God. We use substitute phrases like spirit of life, for example, in one of our favorite hymns. Or a third possible reaction is that we continue to speak of God, but mean something radically different from the classic, traditional, orthodox understandings of what that word means. For me and for many people, and maybe some of you, the most fundamental question may be, where do our deep feelings of right and wrong come from? Right and wrong, fairness versus injustice. Are those feelings just quirky aspects of human evolution, or are they rooted in some deep cosmic source or standard of value that is apart from human existence? I remember an experience I had in a ministers group several years ago when Unitarian Universalists meet for retreats once or twice a year. One of the common things is to invite one of our numbers to give an odyssey, to tell the story of their theological evolution over maybe 60 or 70 or 80 years of life. And I remember one colleague of mine who, after telling his odyssey in over 45 or 50 minutes, said, I believe that there are good actions and that there are good people, but that there's nothing that is the good with a capital G. Nothing cosmically good. And I remember as I sat there thinking to myself, that's the best definition of atheism I have ever heard. Now, there are lots of silly kinds of atheism. The old man in the sky, for example, that no thinking person would ever believe in, even though it persists in our pictures and our paintings and our even our own thinking sometimes. But what about more sophisticated ideas about God? Some ideas that are harder to dismiss or to deny or to live without. I think maybe in our time, well, maybe not our time, but thinking back over the last century, for Jewish people, the Holocaust was the last straw in believing in the existence of a good God. How could our ordinary or traditional understandings of God possibly have allowed something like the Holocaust to happen? But I think theists and atheists both have serious problems with their understanding of good and evil, because it makes a big difference what kind of theist or atheist you are. If you're a theist, precisely what kind of God is it that you believe in? Or if you're an atheist, precisely what kind of God or gods is it that you don't believe in? Seems to me that one of the problems with traditional theism, as I've just said, is explaining the existence of evil. But one of the problems with atheism is explaining the existence of good. Where does it come from? Well, we could write a whole book about questions like that, and many have, but I want to focus this morning on just one matter, the idea of divine power, omnipotence, as we call it theologically, God Almighty. Traditional hymns, and if you grew up in a Christian church, you remember some of these hymns filled with phrases like Almighty God, praise to God on high, and so forth. You might be surprised to know that phrases like that occur nowhere in the Bible. They are entirely a result of the influence of Greek philosophy on earlier Christianity. And that influence has infected, and I do mean infected, our Western ways of imagining or thinking about God for 2 millennia. And in my opinion and the opinion of many others, it's really bad theology, bad in 2 senses. First of all, it's logically incoherent. If you start thinking about it too deeply or carefully, you end up knotted in contradictions. And second, it's damaging to the lives of people who believe it. It supports entirely unrealistic expectations. If God is really almighty, why doesn't he, and it's usually he, do something about it? People suffer because of harboring that kind of idea about God. If this has happened to me, I must be a terrible person. I must have done something incredibly evil. That's what I mean by bad theology. Theology that doesn't help us live life, it makes us feel worse about living. And so what's the corrective? What kind of alteration in our theological garment do we need to make? Well, there are lots of proposals, but I want to talk, as I've suggested already in the reading this morning, about one of those, process theology. Marjorie Suchocki, as I mentioned, who wrote the words of the reading earlier, was one of a number of theologians of the 20th century, going back to Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne, who evolved different ways, new ways of thinking about God. One of my favorite books, where is it here? I thought I had it right there. It is. Charles Hartshorne, Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes. He wrote this, he lived to be 103, by the way. He wrote this when he was in his 80s, but it was drawing on ideas that he had been writing about for many, many years. But it's a great title, Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes. Lots of people have struggled with this. And it's clear that we need some new ways of thinking about God. And I'm not neutral, so let me be clear about my own place in this whole scheme of things. I want, for myself at least, to keep the word God in my own theological vocabulary, but not with very many of the traditional ways of understanding what that word means. And it's in process theology that I have found the most satisfying guidance about how to think about God. There are whole books have been written about process theology, so I've got a challenge to summarize it in a few sentences. One of the features of process theology is the statement that the future is open, as I already mentioned earlier. It's undetermined. It will be shaped by the decisions that we and other human beings and other creatures in our own freedom make. God doesn't know what the future is because there isn't any future for God or anybody else to know about yet. Second, God is not a someone or a something that can exert any kind of physical force. The idea of a supernatural God that can reach down and intervene or suspend the laws of nature is just wrong. No such thing exists. Another point of bad theology. One of my you might be surprised actually to know that these ideas from process theology, while they are philosophical in origin, have been balanced in the last 30 or 40 years by a new movement, believe it or not, from evangelical theology. And one of the interesting people in that movement is a guy named Tom Ord, who was a professor of theology at the Northwest Nazarene Seminary up in Nampa, Idaho. Maybe you know something about that area. He got kicked out of his profession, out of his position for his radical theological ideas. But evangelicals are pushing out these Greek ideas of God as a perfect being and going back to the biblical idea. And as you know in the Bible, if you came out of a tradition where you read that, God is kind of a screw up. In the second week of creation, Eve messes up the plan. A few generations later, human beings have become such a mess that God decides to wipe them all out and save only Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. And then the Hebrews get deported into Egypt, and it's like when you're on the GPS and you take a wrong turn and your phone goes boop, recalculating the route. God seems to be always having to do that. And Tom Ord, from a biblical perspective, has written this book titled God Can't. And it's his answer from an evangelical and biblical perspective about the way in which God is not able, simply not able, incapable of reaching in physically into the world and doing anything. So point 3 about process or open and relational theology. God influences the world as a spiritual force. We're not wrong in our own UU hymns when we sing about spirit of life or spirit of love or spirit of creative change. These are actually helpful metaphors for what we may feel as divine influence in our lives, but that influence is not coercive. It's persuasive. God acts in the world, and this is the 4th point, as a lure. God holds up in our imaginations a vision of the common good, the greater good. And of course, we as free creatures are capable of following that vision or turning away from it. God can only try to persuade, or we can feel drawn maybe to a vision of beauty and goodness, but as you all know, too often we turn away for selfish reasons or out of fear. We make different choices, lesser choices. And evil arises from repeated choices that are selfish or destructive and spread from one person to another, like a disease. It's interesting to me that in a survey of theology made among UU ministers 20 years ago, 1/3 of all the ministers in the UUA at that time identified process theology as their main way of thinking about the world and about God. A couple of these people have written books. Gary Kowalski, my colleague, now retired, living down in Taos, New Mexico, wrote this book, Science and the Search for God. Another more contemporary colleague, Galen Gingerich, a minister of All Souls Church in New York City in Manhattan, wrote this book, God Revised. Again, the garment gets too tight and we have to let it out. So you ministers and other scholars are thinking about these ideas. And in doing that, I think we may even be hearkening back to advice that Ralph Waldo Emerson gave us almost 200 years ago. Saint Waldo, as I like to call him. He warned us against clinging to loyalty to old ideas that are not worthy of our loyalty. Unworthy things, ideas, principles that distract us from what is more deeply worthy. These false gods, these idols, or as Emerson called them, these half gods. And he writes, when the half gods go, the gods arrive. Or to say it a little more differently, when we let go of our bad theologies, our outworn ideas about God or about what we have previously worshiped, we make room then for something new, something more worthy of our deepest loyalty, our deepest love. I think that weaving and reweaving the garments of our theologies, both individually and as a Unitarian Universalist religious movement, is a lifelong task. It certainly has been and continues to be that for me. And our UU tradition has repeatedly, at times of growing pains, needed to expand its collective theological horizons, to weave new ideas into the fabric of the old, to lift up our collective vision into a vista that's more liberating than what we previously knew or could see. And it is a divine vision of beauty, truth, and goodness, I believe, that guides us in that task of weaving, that lures us forward toward the best that we can be. In that sense, God guides us in our weaving. And in the spirit of that theological activity, I invite you now to join with me in singing hymn number 22 in our gray hymnal, Dear Weaver of Our Lives' Design.